Great. Okay. Welcome, everyone. My name is Gayle Matthias. I am the subject leader of 3D Design Crafts program at Plymouth College of Art in the UK. I'm also a practicing artist, researcher, and one of the members of the Glass Virus. And I'll be one of the moderators for this evening's Glass Virus seminar. So this is the second seminar in a series organised by the Glass Virus European think tank. The seminars focus on the exchange of ideas around current topics in glass art, and art education from varied perspectives of recent graduates, young artists, educators, curators, and professionals in the field. So before we begin, I'd just like to say that if the audience has any questions, then please post them in the chat, and I will monitor this and feed some of the questions to the panel towards the end of the conversation. So the panel for this evening's discussion will be Muzi Gigaba, who's an artist and academic at the University of Pretoria, Johan Adam, who's a recent graduate from the Rietveld Academy in Amsterdam, Seran Francis, who's a recent graduate from Plymouth College of Art, UK, and Dr. Mohini Chandra, who is subject leader on the BA photography course at Plymouth College of Art, and also the diversity champion. And Mohini will also moderate the discussion this evening. So the topic for discussion is primarily focused on racial inclusivity in art institutions and higher education. So it appears that many art institutions, universities, museums, galleries and councils are going through another period of transformation and are being pressured to examine their own practice and readdress the underrepresentation of minorities within the art world. So this is not a new revelation. There are many international surveys that portray a complex set of narratives specific to minority groups in different European countries. So for example, in the UK, the Design Council's Design Economy Research Survey of 2018 highlighted that only 13% of designers in the UK are from a Black, Asian, and minority ethnic background. Similar figures are found in the UK Crafts Council report, who makes an analysis of people working in craft occupations, also dated in 2018, which revealed that there is only 12% of makers within a BAME group. This group had to be merged together because individual sample sizes were too small to report. So this evening's panel of artists will be discussing the role that art practice can play to encourage upward mobility, racial equality and diversity in art pedagogy and practice. So in order to make crafts and the arts a supportive and diverse sector. The perspective of the panel is that inclusivity and diversity in the arts are necessary pursuits in order to enhance the visual arts and society as a whole. And so questions will be framed with this in mind. So now I am happy to hand you over to Muzi, Seran, Johan and Mohini, who will give short introductions to themselves and their practice. So Muzi, welcome. Please, can you start with your presentation?
Welcome, thanks for having me. What I'll do is in the chat box, I'll give in the information in terms of like the dimensions of my work because I don't have it on the slides that I'm going to insert here, that I'm going to show here. Hello, everyone. Okay, I'll just get on it because we don't have a lot of time. As mentioned, I'm Muzi Gigaba. I'm from Guamashu Township. I was born 37 years ago. Guamashu Township is a low-class residential area, but we're structured almost like the suburb. Guamashu was built in the 50s to accommodate displaced Black people that were forcibly removed due to unjust discrimination laws. So like any South African township is a hub of Black labor force. You know, it's 15 minutes away from the CBD. A lot can be said about how unsuitable the township setting is for the spiritual and cultural needs of Black people. Let's just say living in the township has led to sort of individualistic improvisation of cultures and and forgetting them. So as our home languages and moral values. So townships are sort of uncomfortable, like semi-urban spaces. So you find that people, they tend to improvise in terms of making up for the culture that has become lost in a way. So in the slide here, there's traditional ceramics in my far corner, which is burnished and smoke fired. So it means it's polished with the stone so that it will shine. And then it's smoke fired and burned with like found objects, you know, like grass and cow dung, so that it will harden. So it's an example of how a traditional Zulu pottery Zulu pot looks like. And the leads are called izimbenge. Those are on top. So I had to insert this this image so I can show you later how it intersects with my work. So the ritual significance of values and cultural meaning of sacred objects and practices are slowly becoming lost in this age of improvisation, like I mentioned. So a self-initiated mentorship, you know, from Clive Sithole, who is a well-known South African ceramist, led me to explore ceramics. So explore ceramics in the sense that I ended up being invited to study at the university. I never wanted to study at the university then because I feared that I'll lose my identity and and my artistic like individuality, you know, and be undermined by the system. Why I'm saying this is that because the history of universities in South Africa had been excluding Black people, you know, within. So it's still like late 70s that we started opening, you know, for Black people. And also those universities were mostly for the Black people. So they were separated from the other universities. So the work on the left, which is a ceramic vessel that is resting on the glass, is titled Sibambelentulo, which means we are holding on the first word. It is a title, yes. So it stood out in the exhibition that I showed in titled Utabezela, which was curated by Dr. Elizabeth Perez from the US. So she was doing a research on local South African pottery. And so she used to come to the students, she saw my work. And then so it stood out to her and to the other professors that invited me to go to the university because it took a different direction from what most artists were exploring, which were more like exploring pottery in a sense. So for me, I was exploring Udu drum, which is a percussion pot from the Igbo tribe in Nigeria, and then fusing it with engravings that borrowed from an old folklore or an old Zulu folktale, if I may say. And my artwork was a triptych, you know. So at that time, it was something sort of interesting or innovative in a way, if I may say, if you are looking at the characters of other artworks, even though they also do their own different explorations. So on the right or on the bottom of the image, it's Inhlanzishelwe Amanzi, which is a title that expressed the situation of desperation. So it's a latest work that I made as a student at the University of KwaZulu-Natal that had to do with me reflecting on the hardships that I had at the university as an artist and a university student with my other two friends that I was with. So the idea of the work was to sort of like break even further, you know, from the spherical form or from the traditional, you know, approach, you know, in terms of like art making, whereby now experimenting with glazes and coming up with forms that have sort of like leads, but still borrowing, you know, from the older traditions. So my work has always been informed by the idea of conserving the language and seeking continuation when it comes to African material culture. Hence, the titles of my works are most in my home languages and are based on sayings and proverbs. Art is a form of expression, you know, after all. So apart from exploring ceramics, I do printmaking. So it's mostly lino cuts. So there's a rich history also when it comes to Black artists in the townships, working in community projects such as Rock Street, Fuba, Artist Proof Studios, and the Bed Center, exploring the lino, because lino is sort of like a cheap material. As a student, I started asking it for free, you know, for offcuts in order to make artworks at the university because I couldn't sustain myself that much when I was studying at the university. So now what happened with this, it's ended up my exploration of printmaking ended up becoming sophisticated in a sense that I ended up making abstract figures that also inspired my ceramics artworks. So that's why on the left, on the right, I created a ceramic series of busts that I call them warriors, which in isiZulu amabutho. So this is where now I was drawing from the printmaking in order to make like ceramics vessels. I mean, ceramics forms. So this has, oh no, it has also pushed to other like a series of explorations of like the clan names and the surnames of people. So for instance, one of these artworks is titled Manyoni, which means is the custodians of the birds, and the other one is Ngwenya, which is the custodian of the crocodiles, and the other one is Matuwe, who's the custodians of the zebras. So my work has this character of having some fonts on it or text on it. Some of it you can see it clearly, but some of it is sort of like script, you know, or so it has to do with uttering phrases on the surface of the artworks, so that it's like it looks at remembering, forgetting, and recalling or erasing memory of oral knowledge, so as of one's identity. So this is it's a complete shift in a way in terms of what I've done before, in terms of my artwork, when it comes to ceramics or exploring like the traditional approach into ceramics, because most of the approach, especially from people from my group, the Zulu people, is mostly like earthenware ceramics that is banished, and it's usually utilitarian, but it's open, of course, you know, when it comes to some other artists. So I sometimes explore these anthropomorphic forms, and then I carry them over also into printmaking. So I do anthropomorphic and I do therianthropic forms. When I talk about therianthropic forms, like these ones you have seen previously, they're a fusion of human and animal forms in a way that they become abstracted. You can't really see if it's a human or an animal. So when you combine the two, then we call that therianthropism. And then, but when we call it anthropomorphism, like if you see the head at the back, you can see sometimes the clear definition of the animals, but they've assigned like the traits of a human. So in that sense, when we are assigning like the human traits onto an animal, we call it anthropomorphism. So this is what is a common thread in my stories, because these forms have been used mostly in stories and oral knowledge systems in order to instill moral lessons and then those stories for sure. So when I do,
I'm wondering how many more slides you have, sorry, in terms of the time frame we have.
Oh, okay. All right. Apart from that, I explore a project that also has to do with conserving culture, in the sense that I explore money box containers, and I've created this series, you know, which is sort of like, it poses the question of what to conserve, or what memory do we store and what memories that we let go, what cultures do we store and what cultures do we let go. And then sometimes I sort of make my artwork sort of like big scale. So it has to do with the idea of monumentalizing, you know, like cultural inspired artworks, but at the same time to show that there is a room for incorporating, you know, like the traditional with the sophisticated or the conventional. In different approach in the project in Serbia, I sort of like created an artwork that was inscribed with the Serbian alphabet, but the people in Serbia, they could sort of like pronounce what's written, but they cannot understand the meaning. So they need me as someone who speaks isiZulu, because whatever is engraved there is in isiZulu, to sort of decode like the information. So in that sense, there's a set of collaborative working, you know, whereby we are all outsiders in a way and insiders. So we need to help each other in terms of accessing the, you know, the information on the artwork. And then this is one of the last projects that I'm going to share with you. It's called #Hlonipha Ulimi Lwakho, Mind Your Language. So this one has to do with me going to indigenous communities and giving them like art supplies, whereby they sort of like make a book art project and they are able to share stories. So I've done one project with the Man community with the in Mexico, the projects in Guamashu Township and in Pretoria. I think I'll stop there for now because we are running out of time. I need to give the other panelists a chance to sort of like share their ideas as well.
Great, thank you very much, Muzi. Seran, would you like to share your presentation with us, please?
So thanks for having me, and this is my presentation of my portfolio. So I am a 23-year-old Black British interdisciplinary artist currently living in Plymouth. My work at the moment consists of creating photoshopped Afrofuturistic and Afro-Surrealist inspired images using a range of mediums, merging digital with traditional processes. So as represented here in the work of Damien Davis, Afro-Surrealism focuses on the present day experience of Africans teetering between what has been and what will be, distorting reality in favor of new gods and a new narrative for what Blackness is. And then Afrofuturism is rooted in science fiction and technology, represented by this image by Kaylin Michel's work. It incorporates a vision of popular culture, a way of imagining possible futures through a Black cultural lens. My background is that I was born in London and then grew up in both Bristol from the ages of 4 to 11 and then Birmingham from 12 to 18. My mother was a metal worker specialising in welding and a teacher and a governor. My father was an avid painter decorator and mechanical engineer. Having parents that regularly employed different creative activities meant that during my time in public education, I was drawn to art. As I moved to secondary school, drawing led to an interest in product design, which then led to carpentry. So by the time I left college, I knew that I wanted to explore material further. This is how I came to study 3D design crafts at Plymouth College of Art. Recently, I've graduated with a first class degree. My time here has granted me the freedom to explore concepts and material, with my practice now favouring the use of ceramics alongside woodwork still. My love of woodwork still stands. However, during lockdown, I began exploring photo montage techniques using Photoshop. So the evolution of 2020 began with my dissertation as I reflected on the Black experience through the study of art craft production. I focused on 3 different historical power struggles, which were slavery, the Harlem Resistance, and the Black Lives Matter movement, and how African American artists showcase their culture through these times by the use of ceramic, fine art, performance, and painting. I asked questions as to whether artists, specifically David Drake, a freed slave in the 18th century, Theastic Gates, and Kiara Walker, to name a few, helped portray the Black experience as more than the Western dictated stereotype, or whether each time Blackness had been commodified and turned into something exotic. To conclude my dissertation, I analysed whether it was necessary or not for Black artists to always have something to say. Does an artist have to portray the modern Black experience through their art, and if so, where is the boundary between white Western art and Black art, and should there be a line at all? The result of this paper proved to be inconclusive, as practitioners from every background, race and culture can choose whether or not to reflect their experiences through their art. So with this theory in mind and continuing this research, hair pop became one of my projects for my final major project. It was mentioned in passing that the individual hairstyles that I create could be considered an art form in their own right. The styling of black Afro hair contained hidden narratives with complex patterned patterns that have been passed down through generations, revealing historic symbolism. It is a part of my culture and it is also my identity. But with most people having a relationship with hair that may or may not define them. In the work Hair Pop, the ceramics became the body and the hair represented patterns, history, power, and beauty. So this is also another prototype that is featured in my work later on. And it was made in lockdown because of the realization that I would have no access to kilns or a workshop. The university had recently released Adobe Access at Home, and around the same time I'd found Afrofuturism, Afro-Surrealism. There was a strong theme throughout my final project. Hair was just the starting point, and Photoshop allowed me to integrate the clay prototypes I was working with in a new light. So here are just some more examples of my work. So in highlighting black hair, I was not only representing the historical events and the internal struggle thereafter, but I was also trying to capture empowerment, culture, identity, consciousness, and self-expression. It became a project of my blackness told through multiple mediums. Every now and again I do work in color. Hey! And this is why I like to class myself as an interdisciplinary artist, as the concepts have now become the most important thing. Working with Photoshop has expanded my visual language, therefore I'm no longer limited to a certain medium. I can more easily formulate the image I have in my head by combining 2D and 3D objects as I see fit. And then some more images. So for me at the moment, my practice is about coming to terms with and also creating a sense of self that was lacking for so long. It's looking at all facets of identity and trying to convey our life, the good with the bad, through a different perspective. Each piece is a reflection of how I was feeling at the moment, and once it's finished, it is then left for others to decipher. I enjoy the stories other people infer about my work. So last slide. Thanks for listening. My name is Seran Francis, and yeah, that's my portfolio.
Great, thank you very much, Seran. Now over to Johan, who's going to show us some examples of his work.
Yes, will do. Thanks for having me as well. So my name is Johan Ibrahim Adam. I was born in 1989 in Sweden. And I started my artistic education in my hometown, Örebro in Sweden in 2014 at the preparatory art school then. And that's when I started to paint and sculpt and write and perform. And this is a painting I made there during the studies in Sweden. And it's a portrait of Karl XII, who was the king of Sweden from 1697 until his death in 1718. And he's considered one of the toughest Nordic colonialists during his time, and even so strong and so tough that many of his own countrymen, the Swedes, then didn't agree to him. And eventually he was killed by a Swede. So here is depicted as he's getting shot in the head by a Swedish bullet. And straight after my education in Sweden, I moved to Amsterdam to pursue a bachelor graduation in at Rietveld Academy. And that's also where I started to work with glass in the glass department. And I had my graduation earlier this year. So about this work, it's from when we, with the glass department, we made an excursion last year to Israel to visit Bezalel School of Arts in Jerusalem. And during that trip, it was also very important for me to visit Palestine, to see like both parts of the wall, which is so really important to me. So I made this piece after the excursion there as a means to reflect about what I met in Palestine and how fragile and almost invisible one's freedom can be. And this is also from the same time, just after we came back from Israel and Palestine. A few weeks later, the holy fasting month of Ramadan started, and I really felt a strong connection with the people in Palestine then, and I wanted to know them, what it was like to do the fasting month that they do every year. And the experience that I got from that, it taught me a lot about compassion. It changed the connection I have to my names and the way that I treat them. And I feel a much stronger value to what I consume with food and water then. And in the upper left corner, you can see it's a repetition of my name and my father's name, which I had to, like, just entering Israel, I had to sort of go into a separate room, and I was forced to repeat these answers over and over and over again. And I think that's also why I feel so strongly connected to all of my names now. And this is a different series. It's called The Evolution of Birds, where I talk about how easy it is to mistake historical events and how we so easily believe a lot of information that's just given straight to us, and how it shapes our perception of history and society as we see it. The upper left one, for example, is a reimagination of a dinosaur, where you can see it singing instead of just shouting, and it's super colorful, and it's always flapping its wings and all these extra features. And on the second one, the top right one, is a comparison then with the extinct dodo and the chicken farm of today. And also last year, I traveled to Pretoria in South Africa for an exchange program of 5 months. And I see this as a great leap in finding myself and defining my artistic practice as well. And I started to work more directly with my surroundings and with issues concerning identity and heritage. And this is made during the same time, during the exchange, and it's a 2-piece work. I don't know if you can see to the right, there is a glass piece, a glass whip. And the other part then is a painting which is depicting a person that's beating to the ground by the just mentioned whip then. And the whip is made out of casted glass and found materials that I found in Pretoria. And the handle also has the imprints of my right hand, and it only fits my hand. And then we move on to this year. So during the lockdown earlier this year, I went back to Sweden and to stay in my family's old farmhouse, where I was cleaning out the old barn. I found all of these really precious materials. So this, for example, is 2 old sacks that probably been used to store grains or potatoes or fertilizer or whatever back in the days, which is like really, really old. I don't really know if it's like 50 years or 100 years old. But that sort of really got me to a strong connection with my Swedish roots. And this then becomes, it's where I stitched together one of those sacks that I found in the barn with a cloth or a canvas that I used while I was in South Africa, just to sort of protect the ground from when I was painting, from the paint and from the stains. the last picture of this presentation is, I call it I Can't Breathe. It's also one of my most recent works. And I think it sort of speaks for itself. It's also painted on one of these, one of the sacks that I found in the barn. And yeah, thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Johan. Mohini is also one of the moderators, is just going to introduce herself and her own practice.
Briefly, yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here. Yeah, so my name's Mohini Chandra, and I'm an artist. I suppose my cultural roots are in India, the Pacific, Australia, and I'm now based in Plymouth, where I'm teaching at Plymouth College of Art. So I just wanted to briefly introduce my practice because I thought it was relevant and kind of why am I here doing this moderating tonight. And I suppose my practice is very much has been tracing family history, family ancestry, and looking at the family photographic collection as a very specific vernacular everyday archive, which perhaps stands in contrast to museum collections and the way that race has perhaps been portrayed in the past, particularly under colonial rule. In that period, Indians were taken from India to Fiji by the port of Kolkata in the Pacific, also to South Africa and other places, but my family background is very much around Fiji, to work in the sugar industry. And at that time, you know, photography was just emerging as a process, and I found that in my research that Indians were depicted in a very specific way, if at all. They were largely invisible in many ways, but they were depicted in this kind of exotified way, whereas indigenous Fijians were depicted in a way that emphasized their so-called primitivism and their conversion to Christianity and becoming civilized. And so I was very interested in the way that these tropes were constructed through photography. Being a photographer myself, coming out of a photography degree in the UK, of course, I was wondering why the medium that I was working in, you know, was so problematic. But I started to look at the family albums and to explore family history as a kind of counterpoint to what I was finding in museums and archives in Fiji and Australia and all over the world, basically. And Indians took over photographic studios in Fiji after the war and built them up as family businesses. And so there's a very strong thread running through the way that Indians visualize their own history and their own experience of a kind of post-indenture world as they emerge from that into a new beginning. So my work at the moment is very much looking at archival images and images that I take. This was a lockdown project very recently. I was thinking about images that I'd made in the Muzi Gigaba in their archive and contrasting them to walks I was having along the River Dart in this moment of loneliness, and we were all kind of worried about what was going to happen. And it was very much a project about this, a particular moment in time. I've also investigated the family archive making collages. This one is all about my father and his experience as a migrant to Australia from Fiji as a student and then on to the UK. And that space in which a migrant is perhaps their mind is in two places at once at least. And I'm very interested in this fluidity of identity and the way that it's expressed through photography. And there were 40 ships that left India to take Indians to Fiji. And so my current project has very much come out of my research into those 40 ships. And by moving to Plymouth, I found myself basically in the heart of empire and looking at the kind of machinery of colonialism. And so I've been working with a group of archaeologists in Plymouth, the Ships Project Plymouth, to examine artifacts that have come up from shipwrecks. And my initial interest was in shipwrecks of indentured laborers over in Fiji that I've been looking at. And I found that there were hundreds of shipwrecks actually in Plymouth, and it was an amazing archaeological site. So my current project is looking at artifacts and objects rather in the way that I looked at photography in the past as an artifact that tells us a story and a history. And this has also moved into film, filming with Mashumi Bomek, and also in Plymouth Sound itself. This site is actually above a slave wreck that is yet to be explored by archaeologists. And so I talked very quickly and I showed you just very much a glimpse of my work, but hopefully that shows you in a way my interest and connection with the artists that have been speaking today, and how we'd love to open up this discussion a little bit more. So I'm just going to stop screen sharing now.
Thank you very much, everyone, all the panelists, for introducing themselves, and some really kind of thought-provoking practice going on there. I think we're now going to enter the sort of second stage of this particular seminar, where we're going to get the panel to kind of ask one another some questions. I know that Seran has a particular, well, Muzi has a question that wants to ask of Seran and Johan. So Muzi, would you like to proceed?
Okay, yes, Seran, I would like to know how your close family members, especially parents, relate to your work inspired by Afrofuturism. Do you feel they can relate? If not, do you find yourself challenged to compromise your approach in order to accommodate any audience that isn't familiar to Afrofuturism or your art approach?
In terms of parents relating, I never necessarily considered that, but for me at least, they would, well, my father at least would get where I'm coming from in terms of self-representation, because I remember all of the stories that he would tell me about, you know, growing up, and the only thing that he would be able to watch and see himself represented was Star Trek, and the only episode that he could then watch was then banned because there was this female who was kissed, and it was like, oh no. So in terms of that may have been a deep-seated like root to where, you know, the Afrofuturism is coming into, but it is self-representation in a way that I think at least looks powerful and represents more than what is assigned to us. So for accommodating others, it's not necessarily my end goal. It is a self-representation and exploration into something more and adding something more to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks. Can I cross over to Johan? Yeah, Johan, I'd like to ask you, how was your art practice? I recall that you mentioned that you were in South Africa. How was your art practice received when you were in South Africa? Do you feel did you feel at home, in a sense that were you comfortable, and how did the people sort of like receive your work when you were in South Africa?
I think, I mean, it's an interesting question, because the school I was in, Tshwane University of Technology, the thing is in Pretoria, there's two different art schools. So there's TUT and there's Tux. And in TUT, it's really like, I don't know if you can say black and white, but it's sort of like the black school. It's for free to be there, and I have the feeling that like the students there, they can't really afford in a way to take the risk to explore a lot, to experiment a lot within the works. It's sort of like they have to make works that they know can sell. So a lot of people there, the feeling I got is that they try to perfect to make like a lot of portraits, and they customize shoes, and they do things that they know that they will make money from in the end. While my work, when I came there, it's really, I mean, you can see it, it's really like sort of explosive. It's a lot of expressionism. There's a lot of risk. There's a lot of like playfulness, which, yeah, then becomes something that I sort of, as a privileged Swedish person, I can afford to work like that. If I don't make it, sort of, I'm not gonna starve. You know, I'm not gonna be broke if I don't sell my work per se. While then in the other school in Pretoria, which is sort of the white school, where it is much more privileged, it is much more rich, it's more, you can really see, like when I was there, at least I could really see that the students there, they can afford to experiment, they can afford to fail. They don't have to sell every work that they make. They can still go on and make more mistakes, you know what I mean? so in that sense, I think my work in the university I was in, it was perceived really like, I think it was an eye-opener, honestly, to a lot of people that I met. At least a lot of friends that I made there, they told me, like, after I went back from there, they're like, "Whoa, shit, you know, you really opened up a way of working for me that I didn't really understand, that it's possible to sort of to be playful and to make works in a different way. That's not sort of the perfect way of making it." That answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, yes, it does.
Mm.
Do you have any question for me? Oh.
I do, in relating to that, relating to what I just said, like, because you're teaching at University of Pretoria, right?
Yes, part-time. I work there part-time.
Okay. And what I just said, like, the art scene is still so freaking white, even in South Africa. In a black country, it's still so white. Whenever you go to a museum, whenever you go to a gallery, you're surrounded by the same sort of audience, the same people that I would meet here in Europe. And I'm sort of, I mean, this is of course really like an open discussion, but do you have any idea, like, why is that even in South Africa? Shouldn't that attract an audience that's way sort of broader?
Yes. You see institutions, you know, we're talking about the issue of institutions, you know. When you're talking about museums, you're talking about art galleries, we're talking about universities. In South Africa, most of these institutions were established, you know, by the white minority then, you know, like if I'm talking about the British and Afrikaans people. So in that sense, there were sort of like laws whereby they discriminated or marginalized the black majority. So because of that, these institutions they've developed, they've worked hard developing these institutions, but with their own money, no matter how much they attained it. So in that sense, they are still owning most of these institutions, you know, when I'm talking about art galleries especially. And they have reputation because in a way, they sort of also involved some of different races, you know, in South African, like artists, to participate abroad. So there are people or other institutions elsewhere that trust their judgment and their taste. So in that sense, it ends up like they are feeding them, you know, in terms of like they give them a taste of what is popular or what is current or what is in or what is viable, you know, in any conversation, in a local or a conversation at that time. So that's why you find that in most cases, the art markets in South Africa, it has like few people, you know, who are sort of like in charge. I can count, like it's only 2 galleries that I know of that are owned by black people. They are sort of like doing well. It's Gallery
Banele Kosa, huh?
It's Momo Gallery and Banele Kosa, you know, he started a intervention. So, but it will come eventually. And then the other thing you find that most people, you know, like myself, where I come from, the township, it depends where you come from, but some people were not as exposed to arts. In the sense that art serves a different purpose, you know, it's a matter of different value system. So now when we are thinking of arts in the gallery context and then selling and showing at exhibitions, you need to consider who is your audience and how you're going to make a living out of that. So the question is, how are we opening up these spaces in terms of like, how is the government now? Because it has changed, you know, we have 21 years of democracy now in South Africa. The government somehow should be sort of like intervene because now we have sort of like freedom. It's no longer times of apartheid, whereby they can intervene and find ways in which we can sort of like balance an equation in terms of accessibility of arts.
And do you see this changing as well the last few years? Or?
For me, I haven't seen much. That's why the artwork that I make, in most cases, it speaks to people that, you know, I know that are still sort of like left in the dark when it comes to a different dimension in the art making sector. So that's why you find that I make self-initiative, you know, projects where I go by to the townships. In fact, I was also hoping to go to Zambia so that I can sort of like have a cross exchange, but on the ground level, you know. I can go to schools instead, and then so that people can be able to access other art from other places and hear different voices, maybe from the Mayans as well, so they can see a point of connection as well. So I'm not waiting on anyone, you know, when it comes to that. So if it happens, it happens, but I can't stop and wait as an artist.
Great. I think Seran also had a question for Muzi. Seran, would you like to ask your question?
So saying that you are self-proclaimed going out there and doing your own thing, so the consideration of identity and culture in your work, that has to be in it. Is that the main factor? Is that the driving force behind to?
I think it has to do with self-liberation in a way for me, you know. There's this thing, or usually it's a saying when they say you become the change that you want to see. So if I feel that this area is not explored as much, then I choose to explore it. Like for instance, when I did my master's, I looked at 2 artists who also work with human animal forms, but in a different context than mine. But then now when it comes to reading about these artworks, you know, in magazines, or when you go to art galleries and see the catalogs or how they're represented abroad, you find that the meaning only speaks to a select majority that usually lies on the Western side of things, you know. And then you find that there's a deeper meaning because they also use like titles that come from their home languages. So the thing with me, it has to do with that there is value, there is meaning, there are philosophies that are imbued within languages. So how can we explore and sort of like expose it to the Black majority here in South Africa so they can be able also to access art and read from a different point of view? If we can achieve that in a way, we can also sort of like inspire and stimulate, you know, any innovativeness, you know, from things that you can understand, you know, from your own point of view, so that we don't have to always depend on others that they'll develop things for us.
Yeah. It's building a kind of community for, you know, people to appreciate as well. Because
appreciate themselves, because we have assimilated a lot into Western idols in a way. I'm not fighting against it. You know, we need to borrow from each other and learn from each other, but it's been a long time since we have been, you know, able to have a moment or a chance whereby we can choose to modify things on our own. So I think my work deals with provoking that, whether as a practitioner, in a community project, or as an artist.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it strikes me that there's something in common with all of our work, in that we're obviously inspired by our backgrounds and either looking for something in vernacular explorations of imagery, as I am in photography, or looking at traditional art forms, so-called art, you know, traditional art forms for our inspiration. So there is something very important to us about identity. But so I think that Seran, you pointed out a strange paradox, that in some way you wanted the line between, I think, what we might call black and white to be dissolved, or you weren't really quite, that was a question of your dissertation, that you weren't really sure. So I wanted to ask both Seran and Johan how important these issues of identity are for you, that they be foregrounded in your work. And is it a strange paradox that in a sense you want equality as well within that?
Well, considering this has been a conversation for many generations, it's not that it has fallen upon my shoulders or our shoulders, but it is still a talking point within my family, at least. So because I've been fed that, it's then, okay, how can I then try and open that conversation within my world to then broaden it out to then, you know. But it's a lot of talking and trying and showing to then hopefully gain something. back in terms of people accepting, changing minds, equality, breaking down barriers, it's a constant to try and
it's a constant struggle that's been for like centuries already. And I think it's funny when you're saying about trying to sort of dissolve the blackness and whiteness, sort of, which is, I feel almost like I'm a walking paradox, you know, because my mother is white and my father was black, and I'm sort of this half white, half black. But in the end, of course, I'm not half anything. I'm 100% me. I'm 100% person. And it's sort of almost when I started making art myself, when I started to get into this sort of full philosophical thinking in a way, that's also when I realized that I'm a full person. And I realized that I can talk about my heritage from only one standpoint in a way, only from my standpoint. And also realizing that the struggle is real. The struggle has been for as long as anyone can remember, and way before that as well. So definitely it's we need to repeat it. We need to constantly repeat it until enough people start to listen and start to see and start to realize.
I think it's really interesting to hear from artists of your generation emerging now, because in some ways I feel like I was facing the similar questions 20 years ago when I was emerging from art college, and it was really difficult to have these debates without being seen as being very, very confronting. And you know, it's was a constant struggle to find a place and support and things like that. And I just wondered, do you feel now in this point in time, does art practice help us to consider issues of diversity within the arts education environment? Does it help us to take the journey further or the debate further?
I like to think so. I like to think so, definitely. and I like to think so, and I think maybe for that reason I really do think so as well.
I think so too. I think arts have always served that function, you know, the most, and in a nice or in a palatable manner also, you know, in a sense that it's through music, and then it's through exhibition, it's through performances, you know, all over, where you get to share all these messages or try to evoke or stimulate people, you know, into a certain direction. In a sense that in South Africa, at some point, they even banned like, you know, musical instruments. There were places whereby they had to ban them because they knew that they were now acting this political agenda of whereby they're trying to advocate for change.
Seran, did you want to pitch in on that one at all?
No, I did. I mean, yeah. So what was the question again, sorry?
Well, we were asking whether art practice itself helps us in this kind of struggle or this discourse and in trying to consider or address diversity within the arts and the education environment.
Considering, yeah, it does, because especially in a university setting, at least for me, that's where I can kind of come in from. Universities at least have been trying to, or are more accepting of, because it's an art university, you can, you know, talk about these things and put them out there and be as diversive as you want to be, because you're just trying to like find your footing and, you know, get your practice, get your voice. So it's always been there, and being in a place that at least allows you to express that, whether it be a university, a gallery, your art practice, it's needed to progress from the most aversive thing to the most controversial thing. You kind of need it to push you, to get you thinking, to get some action, to get some change.
Yeah, that's great. That's very positive. But do you think that art institutions need to, and how do they address a general lack of diversity in programming and staffing and the kind of statistics that Gayle was talking about at the beginning? Do any of you have any thoughts about that?
I mean, through looking at themselves and then looking at, because I don't want to say necessarily that this is popular and it's something that they have to address because it's so front and forward. But in a sense, if this is something that keeps on coming back around, something needs to happen somewhere. So by looking within their own institutions and being like, there seems to be an awful lot of the same faces, how can that be, then broadened out? And it's quite easy by just going, hello, we're looking for this type of person to help broaden our own institution, galleries, work, what we put out into the world, because we're out here and it seems that people aren't necessarily trying their hardest to find or to look or to encapsulate and help.
We have, I think you mentioned, we have a really important moment, don't we, at the moment? Social justice movements such as the Black Lives Matter movement and Me Too movements. Do you think this is a really important moment in terms of increasing inclusivity in the arts? I could ask that of you, and I could ask that of Muzi or Johan as well.
I think it's significant, it's significant, but at the same time, I've always asked myself, why do we always have to sort of like push or try to convince certain people? Aren't we all human, Don't we all share, the same, basic values, as humans? They're very important. I think they should continue and addressing many other movements if that's what it takes for a change to take place. And I was just smiling as Serena was talking now, thinking about the role of institutions, that side, how accommodative they are. Yeah, in my country, they are trying to, but I think it's still a problem. There's still a long way to go in terms of, because when it comes to art department, like the one that I were into in the University of Johannesburg, most of the staff members are white. So you find that they can't relate fully, and they don't know what role or how to play their role. So there's that challenge of how do we get to negotiate certain roles? How can universities or institutions find ways to become permeable so that there can be a penetration of things that are from inside and then outside? So as it stands at the moment, some universities are employing us, like practicing artists, to get in there and then do workshops so that we can bring in sort of like a fresh voice. But somehow at the same time, it's not fully enough. We need to see different people of different races interacting and working, at universities or any other institution, so that even when there are these movements, in a way, we can see that there's change. When we're talking about Black Lives Matter, we can see that it really matters. We don't have to say it anymore, because we can see that in the end, all lives are sort of like balanced, and then the all matter in the same way. We don't have to worry about, wanting to matter, as Black people.
Yeah, so it's asking really important political questions. I mean, I don't think that art can come up with the answers, but it can ask provoking questions, and that's something that you were talking about, and also kind of indicate a kind of diversity in wider society that needs to be recognized and be more inclusive in that way. But is it still a problem that there's a potential for work such as the ones we've been talking about today, our own work, to be either exotified and always then seen as interesting but on the outside, or even worse, appropriated? So a curiosity about other cultures then becomes a kind of appropriation, which we know has happened historically. I wonder what the panel thinks about that question.
I'm not sure about the question, honestly, sorry.
Okay.
I think for me, I might understand what we're talking about because something that I experience as well. You know, when sometimes you go to certain countries in a residency, and then some people, they'll start asking you, like, why your work is not so colorful? You know, you're from Africa. Your work should be colorful, you know. Why are you exploring only black and white lino cuts when you're an African, you know? Maybe you're not African enough. So in that sense, it's you know what I mean, that it's romanticized, like all Africans should be doing only this. They don't understand that we have movements as well. In a sense, like I told you, that there were township movements that dealt with only black and white, you know, lino cuts. So in a way, my work, when I explore only that dimension, I'm sort of contributing a different sophistication, you know, to the conversation about the lino cuts as a material and how diverse it can be. Yeah, so you find that elsewhere, and also when it comes to South Africa as well, you find that, especially in Johannesburg, I'm not saying all artists are doing the same thing, but there's a majority of people who may end up copying each other because they can see that there's certain vocabulary that is selling. So in that sense, you end up finding that there's now a market for that vocabulary. So now when we are coming in with something that's sort of like, it's different, you know, it's not sort of like ordinary in a way. You
It's
don't
not
know
ready
where
for the art world yet. Well,
you don't know where you belong. There's like that's my story in most cases. So that's why I don't wait for anyone. It's either I go anywhere until people they catch up, or until I do another project which will sort of like will meet halfway or anyway with them, because you find that they can't really know where to locate me, how to locate me, you know, with my work, because somehow it brings a sophistication that maybe some people are not as ready for.
Really interesting discussion, and I think we could probably all give examples from our own locations, but I'm aware that there are a couple of questions in the audience. And Gayle, do you want to bring those questions in now?
Yeah, I've got two questions here. One from Paranaz. So I'd like to know about the role of education in the art at university on the improvement of your artistic works. So what's the role of education in improving your artwork?
Good question. I think maybe Seran and Johan have the most recent experience of that, so it'd be lovely to hear from them.
Sorry, continue.
Thanks. So for me, the role of education improving artwork? So for me,
education, yeah, in the art, yeah, in improvement of the artistic work.
It was just allowing myself to be in an environment that valued art. And I just wanted to explore, and being outside of that, so when I had my gap year and when I did a little bit in college in carpentry, I didn't necessarily find that I had then the motivation or the knowledge or a starting point, like a good solid starting point that a brief or a lecturer could give me. And then as soon as I got that, no offense, I would then go and do my own thing, because I would be like, okay, I've got a good solid point in which I can then explore something else. So I didn't necessarily find where I wanted to go until my third year, but in first year and second year, I had a whale of a time exploring ceramics and glass and metal work. And, you know, that just helped to put something in my experience bank and my working bank and my practitioner bank that I wouldn't necessarily have got elsewhere, for me. Yeah.
Thank you. I've got another question from Isabel. We just had 3 or 4 questions just come in the end. So I was thinking we just got 2 questions. So I'll try and just fit some of them in. So Isabel's question is quite long. She's a young visual artist from Belgium. So during her degree in philosophy studies, she met a friend who recently asked if she could organize an exhibition concerning the topic of ecofeminism. Inclusivity and diversity is the central focus of the project. She's interested to hear if the panel has any recommendations in scouting artists for this project, and if there are any sensibilities I have to take into account in their approach. Has anybody got any recommendations for Isabel?
I don't really have like any names per se that I can put as a recommendation now, but I think like if you are surrounded with people with your interests, with those interests, I think those are the people you should listen to, and those are the books that you should read. And that's like wherever you get your material, you know, even if it's a TV show or whatever. I think through that might be like the strongest, and for me like the most sort of, I don't want to say real, but what's the word, the most honest inspiration as well, to take what you see in your everyday life. Like I think that's, yeah.
I think if you want emerging artists, you could put out an open call and have a look at the work that comes in, or work with some key institutions in terms of their students or their graduating students. So that would be one suggestion in terms of finding people.
I've got another question here from Erin. So after this year's Black Lives Matter process, it seems institutions, specifically GLAS, made an effort to be more inclusive in their programming. However, a lot of the changes were purely in the interest of the institution, that is increasing diversity percentage and not taking into account the individual's needs. How do we hold institutions accountable and give individuals the power to demand more from these relationships? Who would like to respond to that question?
How do you tell the top people to take responsibility? That's like, it's just sort of, I don't know.
Because then again, it then falls into your hands to then, or the artist's hands to then ask and, you know, knock down those doors again of going to the top people and trying to get the equality that they deserve. But then it shouldn't then fall down all onto the people that are at the bottom to be like, yo, people at the top, like, listen, we're here. Don't just include us because you need us, because that's not a relationship that's equal for both parties. It's like benefiting you, but not benefiting us in terms of the equality. So I wouldn't necessarily know how to go about doing it because I've never necessarily had to, not yet. Hopefully, maybe, who knows. But it's, yeah, it then comes down to asking, protesting again.
I think that's what I was talking about in terms of the university being malleable, you know, or porous, in a sense that people shouldn't be intimidated by the staff, you know, when they're at the university. You know, the university should have a certain agenda and everyone should know what the agenda is. And then people should be able to voice their own, you know, concerns as well, but in a nice, polite way. You know, we don't always have to protest. We have to talk about things like, okay, we can see that you are doing certain things. We have done this and that for us, or on this agenda, but could you kindly consider this and this and this and what, because we are feeling that it's lacking here and there. It doesn't always have to be about fighting and reels. You know, here in South Africa, in most cases, people would be just jumping and fighting with the system, but we have to engage it. I think we need to find ways of engaging, because in a way you might find that the university was trying to do a good thing, but at the same time, it's not enough. So if it's not enough, then the students have to address it, but in a nice, polite manner, I think.
Okay. Yeah, I agree. I think it has to be a conversation, doesn't it? And I think each party has to be willing to learn from each other. And I think I think these days students are much more in conversation with the institution. I think something has shifted in terms of the accountability of institutions to students, and to, you know, make the experience a rich one and a really positive one. I mean, I think for me, having worked in education for a long time, I think the changes have to be visual. You know, you have to see diversity, you have to see diverse staff, you have to then see diverse students and diverse practices. And that visibility is really important, but it's not enough on its own. You know, that can be window dressing. What we need is a kind of more structural change, and the way that people actually come to work in the university needs to be broadened. And these are things that will take, you know, a real effort in terms of people who make policy, and people who govern, and people who lead institutions, to make a commitment to doing that. And it's a form of positive discrimination that's needed. And if it upsets people, some people, I think that it has to happen, because for too long it's gone the other way, really. But yeah.
I think that's a good point to actually draw this discussion to a conclusion, I would say. So I know there was a couple more questions, but I think we're running out of time, so apologies for that. So yeah, draw this evening's event to close by thanking the speakers for fascinating and thought-provoking discussions. I hope that we can expand upon this discussion in future events. So thank you to Muzi, Seran, Johan and Mohini for moderating the discussion. I'd like to thank the Glass Virus Advisory Committee for organising these seminars. The next Glass Virus seminar will be on Wednesday, the 16th of December, and the topic will be writing as a way of making. Once again, so thank you everybody for attending this event this evening. So thank you very much.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you all for.
Thanks for having us. Thank you to the panelists for sharing their ideas. It was a thought-provoking discussion. Thank you.